Tonight, we're not chasing outlaws or drawing pistols at dawn. No gallows, no wanted posters. We're slipping into something quieter, but far more brutal. The slow, itchy misery of bad hygiene in the Wild West. The stink under the hat. The grit on your gums. The bathwater that looked more like stew than soap. Because behind every gunslinger myth lies a dirtier truth. The West wasn't clean. It was crusted, cracked, and crawling. Soap cost more than supper. Teeth were optional, and if you smelled better than your horse, you were probably dreaming. This is the story of sweat and stink, of days without washing, weeks in the same shirt, years without a toothbrush, of lice, grease, and shared water so foul it could knock a buzzard off a gut wagon. We won't flinch. We won't dress it up. This is the untold story of Western filth, slow, sticky, and painfully real. If you like drifting through the forgotten corners of history, soft-lit, dust-cloaked, and uncomfortably human, like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Now breathe out, let the day slide off you. Let's step into a world where nobody smelled good, and everybody lied about it. Let's begin. They built the bathhouse behind the saloon, not because it was convenient, but because the stench had to stay downwind. It was made of mismatched lumber, with gaps in the walls big enough to watch dust dance through the light. Inside, a single iron tub sat on a sloped plank floor, stained with rust and ringed with grime that never quite scrubbed away. They called it the soak, and no one used it without a wince. The water came from the well, hauled in barrels, warmed over fire, poured by hand. It took 3 men to fill the tub and 4 coins to claim it for an hour. And no one got fresh water. You bathed in the order you arrived, or in the order your reputation allowed. First man in got the cleanest dip. By the time the 5th came through, the water looked like stew. Hair, sweat, bits of hay, sometimes blood, always cloudy. But people used it anyway, because there were no other choices. They say the mayor once offered free soaks on Sundays to raise morale. It worked for a time, until a miner with an infected leg used the tub and no one else would touch it for a week. The smell lingered, the stains darkened, and the Sunday soak was quietly forgotten. Most folks didn't bathe often. Water was precious. Soap, more so. A single bar could cost a quarter's wages. Lye and tallow boiled down into a gritty square that burned if you had cuts, which everyone did. Washing meant effort. Hauling, heating, scrubbing. It meant being vulnerable, naked in a world where modesty was currency. So they avoided it, laughed about it, bragged even. "I bathe with whiskey," one cowboy liked to say. He didn't. No one believed him. Instead, they relied on what they called dry cleaning, wiping down with a rag, rubbing dust with more dust, changing into shirts that hadn't been washed, just left outside to air. And everyone smelled all the time. Not just body odor, but horses and smoke and old beer spilled on boots weeks ago. And because everyone stank, no one noticed. You wouldn't last a day, not because of the dirt, but because of the silence around it. You'd look for soap, for water, for a wash basin that wasn't cracked. You'd ask when the linens were last changed and no one would understand the question. Because this wasn't about comfort. It was about getting through the day, dirty or not. Still, some tried. A widow named Clara washed her hands every night with water she saved from boiling potatoes. Said it kept the memories clean. A stable boy used stolen rainwater to rinse his hair once a week, then tied it up with ribbon to keep the flies away. And one man, a piano player with crooked fingers, carried a brush in his coat and cleaned his nails each morning with the care of a man preparing for church. The water has stilled. The tub is empty. The fire has gone out. You are not in line. You are not waiting with a towel in hand and a coin in your pocket. You are clean. You are warm. You are far from the bathhouse behind the saloon. Close your eyes. Let the grit slide away. Let the memory of dirt become distant. You are not there. You are here. Safe. Untouched by the stink of old sweat and the long, slow rot of unwashed skin. You are wrapped in something soft. You are breathing air that does not carry the weight of 10 bathed strangers. And let the past rinse itself away, teeth like tombstones. If you had good teeth in the Wild West, you kept them hidden. Smiling too wide was a kind of brag, and bragging invited trouble. Because most mouths back then were battlefields, crooked, cracked, half-rotted trenches of enamel and pain. Toothache wasn't a rare complaint. It was a part of life, like dust in your lungs or blisters on your heels. Everyone had it in some form, a throb beneath the jaw, a sharp stab with every chew, a molar that moved when you ran your tongue across it, like a stone that hadn't quite settled. There were toothbrushes, yes, if you had coin. Imported from back east or across the ocean, with bone handles and stiff bristles made from boar hair. But they were rare and prized and often used long past usefulness. Soap served as toothpaste if you had it. Salt if you didn't. Some swore by charcoal, crushed and rubbed on with a cloth. Others chewed mint leaves, pine needles, or just prayed for numbness when the pain got too loud. Dentists existed, barely. They traveled in wagons, part doctor, part showman, with pliers that rattled in wooden boxes and promises too smooth to be trusted. There were no drills, no anesthetics, no soft music or clean white rooms. Just a chair, a hand on your shoulder, and a bottle of something strong to bite down on. If you were lucky, you passed out. If you weren't, you screamed. Tooth removal was the only treatment most people knew. The idea of fixing a tooth was laughable. Abscesses were drained with heated knives. Gums were packed with whiskey-soaked cotton. And when the infection spread to the bone, and it did, often, death came with a fever and a rattle in the throat. It wasn't noble, it wasn't fast, it just ended you. The worst part wasn't the pain. It was the shame. Bad teeth meant poverty, meant failure, meant you couldn't afford to be clean, even on the inside. People learned to talk with their lips closed, to chew on one side, to stop laughing altogether. And in photographs, those still grim portraits nailed to parlor walls, no one smiled. Not just because of the long exposure times, but because smiling meant showing what you'd lost. You wouldn't last a day, not because the ache would break you, but because of how common it was, how no one spoke of it, how everyone accepted that pain lived in the mouth, under the tongue, behind every word. You'd want to help, you'd want to offer a toothbrush, a rinse, a simple kindness, but the people around you would only shrug, say it was part of the deal, part of being alive. Still, a few held on to hope. A barber in Carson City offered cleanings with a knife and thread. Said it wasn't gentle, but it helped. A school teacher taught children to rinse their mouths with warm salt water after every meal. Called it a ritual, a quiet defense. And one man, a coffin maker of all things, whittled toothbrushes from bone and gave them away with each sale. Said it was the only blessing he knew how to give. The ache is gone. The jaw has softened. The teeth are whole. There is no rot beneath your tongue, no sharpness in the back of your mouth, no rusted pliers waiting, no bottle to bite down on, just breath, just rest, just the gentle stillness of a world that no longer expects you to suffer in silence, water you couldn't trust. It looked clean enough sometimes. A clear trickle through rocks, a well with a smooth rope and a wooden bucket, a rain barrel catching silver drops in the dry season. But in the Wild West, water wasn't innocent. It carried things, not just mud and grit, but illness. Secrets and consequences. You could drink from a stream and feel fine. Until 2 days later, when your stomach twisted like a snake in a bag and your mouth went dry no matter how much you drank. They called it camp fever, or river gut, or just bad water. They didn't know about bacteria. They just knew who didn't wake up. There was no filtration, no purification. If you were lucky, someone boiled the water. If you weren't, you drank what the cattle drank, or what the horse bathed in, or what sat still in a barrel for so long it grew a skin of algae and a smell like wet pennies. Travelers learned to sniff before sipping. Settlers learned to pray. And everyone learned not to trust the taste, no matter how cold it ran. Wells were better, until they weren't. A dead animal too close, a leaky outhouse uphill, and suddenly the cleanest water in town could turn. Fast. A single bad drink could kill a child in hours, could send a family scrambling for help that didn't exist, and cholera wasn't a headline. It was a memory, written into the land like scars under a shirt. People adapted, carried canteens filled from distant springs they trusted more than the ones near home. Mixed whiskey into every cup, not just for the flavor, but because they believed the burn could save them. Drank coffee and beer instead of water when they could, and when they couldn't, they drank anyway. Fast, like it might turn before it reached the throat. You wouldn't last a day, not because the water would kill you, but because you'd be afraid of it. You'd hesitate before each sip. You'd search for a filter that doesn't exist, a guarantee no one can offer. And the people around you would only shake their heads. Drink it or don't, they'd say. It's all we've got. Still, some found ways to soften the blow. A widow in Sweet Hollow boiled everything twice and let it cool in a clay jug wrapped with damp cloth. Called it her baptism. A traveling tinker carried a pouch of silver coins and dropped one into every barrel. Said it sweetened the water, though it probably didn't. And a child in Wyoming carved a tiny boat out of pine and floated it in her cup each time she drank. Said it made the water feel like home, the itch that never went away. They didn't talk about lice, or fleas, or the quiet squirm of something tiny living beneath the fabric of a shirt. But everyone felt it. The itch that started at the scalp and crept behind the ears, the twitch at the base of the neck, the rawness on the ankles after a night spent scratching in the dark. In the Wild West, parasites weren't just a nuisance. They were permanent. A part of life like calluses or sunburn or coughing in the dry season. They came with the territory and they stayed. Most people wore the same clothes for weeks, sometimes longer. A single shirt, stiff with sweat, worn from sunrise to sunset and through the night again, hanging heavy with dust and the salt of old effort. Underthings were a luxury. Undershirts, thin and threadbare, were washed when water was spare, which wasn't often. Blankets in boarding houses were passed from man to man, sheet to sheet, body to body, until they stopped smelling like anything but sweat and firewood. And the things that lived in them, lice, mites, tiny things without names, lived well. People scratched constantly, on porches, in pews, around fires behind curtains. It wasn't rude, it was necessary. A man with clean skin was suspicious, either rich, dishonest, or ill. Women combed their hair in the open, searching for nits by firelight. Mothers rubbed ash or kerosene into their children's scalps to kill what they couldn't see. Some said it worked. Others just went bald and called it a style. Fleas came with the animals, with hay, with floorboards, with the seams in your boots. You didn't see them, not until they jumped. Not until you felt a sting behind your knee or between your fingers and couldn't stop scratching. And they didn't just live in beds. They lived in the walls, in the blankets, in the very fabric of daily life. You learned to ignore them the way you ignored hunger or the ache in your back. You got used to it, or you didn't. You wouldn't last a day, not because of the bugs, but because of the way no one else flinched. You'd feel the itch and think something was wrong. They'd feel it and think, same as yesterday. You'd want to fix it. They'd want to survive it. Still, there were moments of relief. A traveling woman carried a tin of lavender powder and gave it away by the pinch, pressing it into palms like a prayer. A doctor in Deadwood stitched pouches of mint and pine together and told patients to wear them around their necks. Keeps the crawl away, he said. And one old man, a trapper who hadn't spoken in years, was seen washing his coat in the river every full moon, rubbing it with crushed sage and hanging it like a flag to scare the fleas. The itch is gone. The seams are clean. There are no tiny legs crawling against your skin, no bites blooming beneath the cloth. The blanket is yours. The bed is yours, and nothing else is hiding in the folds. The air wasn't clean either. When people picture the Wild West, they often imagine open skies, blue and endless, and fresh air rolling through canyons like a gift. But the truth was far more bitter. The air might have moved, yes, but it wasn't clean. Not in the lungs, not in the houses, not in the saloons, where it hung heavy with pipe smoke and spilled beer and the sourness of unwashed men packed shoulder to shoulder. It wasn't crisp and pine sweet. It was thick, grimy, tired. Wood stoves smoked inside one-room homes that lacked proper chimneys. Coal fires burned hot and low, sending soot into every crevice. Black dust clinging to lace curtains, to dinner plates, to babies' noses. Candles flickered with a kind of stubborn stink, tallow wax that smelled like animal fat, because it was. And when the wind blew, it didn't carry freshness. It carried more dust. From the road, from the paddocks, from the outhouse. Fine, dry particles that got into your teeth, your hair, your breath, until you coughed not from sickness but simply from being alive. People didn't talk about air quality. There wasn't a name for it. Just the rasp in your throat, the way your eyes burned when the firewood smoked wrong, the way your lungs felt after a day in the saddle, or worse, a night beside the forge. The blacksmiths coughed more than most. The miners coughed even more. And there were no masks, no ventilation, just the hope that your chest would settle by morning. And then there was the outhouse. Built behind most homes and every saloon, it was little more than a box with a hole and a door that never quite latched. In the heat, the air turned thick around it. In winter, it froze the stench in place. There were no septic systems, no sewage treatment, just pits that filled too fast and drained too slow. The smell didn't stay put. It wandered. It found its way into kitchens, into beds, into the walls of schoolhouses and churches. There was no escaping it, only enduring it. You wouldn't last a day, not because you couldn't breathe, but because every breath would feel borrowed. You'd step outside, hoping for relief, and find more of the same. You'd think of perfume, of clean towels, of springtime air through an open window, and realize those luxuries were still lifetimes away. Still, they tried. A woman in Dry Creek strung wet linens over her porch, hoping the wind would pick up their scent. A preacher burned sage before services, saying it kept away both sin and sickness. And children, when they could, climbed trees just to breathe above it all, to feel a whisper of something pure, even if only for a moment. The fires have burned low. The wind has calmed. The dust has settled. There is no soot in your throat, no smoke in your eyes. The air here is soft, still, easy. You can breathe without thinking, without coughing, without worry. Clothes that never came clean. The shirts were never white. Not really. Even when they started that way. After a week on the trail, a day in the stables, an hour under the midday sun, They turned the color of old paper, of river silt, of sweat soaked so deep it became part of the weave. In the Wild West, cleanliness wasn't measured by sparkle. It was measured by smell, by the weight of the fabric, by whether or not it could still hold shape when you peeled it off at the end of the day. Laundry wasn't a chore. It was an ordeal. First, you needed water, buckets of it. Then you needed soap, if you had it, and a wash tub, and a paddle, and time, hours of time. Clothes had to be scrubbed with hands that were already raw, beaten against boards that splintered with use. Then they had to be rinsed, wrung out, hung up, and hoped over. Hoped the wind wouldn't carry them off. Hoped the dust wouldn't return before they dried. There were women who made a living washing clothes. Tough women. Strong-backed, red-knuckled, silent types. They set up behind saloons, near rivers, in tents, charged by the piece. Shirts, trousers, long johns. If you wanted them ironed, that cost extra. If you wanted them actually clean, that cost your dignity. Because to get anything clean in that world meant watching it fall apart faster. Most folks didn't bother. They wore the same thing day after day, wiped off the worst of it with a rag, dusted off the shoulders, called it good. They hung their clothes on a nail by the door, let the breeze pass through them, and told themselves it was enough. And it had to be. Underwear was rare. Socks were patched until the holes outnumbered the threads. Women's dresses were layered, not for modesty, but for insulation, to keep the sweat from showing too clearly. And when something ripped, it was sewn. Again and again, until it wasn't worth saving. Then it was torn into rags. And the rags? Those became washcloths, bandages, diaper wraps. Nothing was wasted, not even filth. You wouldn't last a day. Not because the clothes would break you, but because you'd never stop thinking about them. You'd feel the collar cling to your neck. You'd smell the sourness rise when you sat too long. You'd want a fresh shirt, a clean pair of socks, a towel that didn't smell like last week, and no one around you would understand why it mattered so much. Still, there were small mercies. A girl in an orphan house near the Rio Grande would sprinkle her wash with crushed lavender and tie the line with blue ribbon so the children could pretend the wind was perfume. A widow in the hills embroidered flowers into the corner of every shirt she cleaned, even if the stains never came out. Said it made them feel like they had something new, even if they didn't. And a boy, no older than 10, once offered his only handkerchief to a stranger who looked too tired to ask. The shirts have been folded. The socks are whole. The wind is clean. There are no stains here, no sweat, no oil ground into the cuffs. You are wrapped in fabric that smells only of comfort, of quiet, of something that never had to be scrubbed. Let the old dirt fall away. Let the threads loosen. Let your skin feel what it's like to be untouched by labor, by salt, by the ache of too many days in too few clothes. You are not in rags. You are not waiting by the line. You are warm and soft and still. And let the laundry wait 100 years. Hair wasn't meant to shine. They didn't call it greasy. They called it practical. Long hair meant warmth. Meant you didn't waste time cutting it. Meant you weren't soft. In the Wild West, hair was rarely trimmed, rarely styled, and almost never washed. Men grew it because there wasn't time to fuss, and women braided it to keep it from tangling in the wind. But no one had shampoo, no conditioner, just water, if you were lucky, and sometimes lard or ash or vinegar if someone in town had a barrel left over from the pickling. Combs were precious. Brushes more so. A good brush passed through families like heirlooms, with boar bristles worn down to the root, and soap, when there was any, wasn't made for scalps. It stripped everything. The oil, the grit, the skin, left your scalp tight, your hair rough as straw, and your spirit just a little more tired. Barbers weren't stylists. They were surgeons with scissors. They cut hair with razors that had shaved 5 men before you, sometimes still wet. They'd pour whiskey over the blade, call it clean, and ask how short you wanted it. "Short enough to stop the itching," most men said. Then they sat still while the blade slid close, praying it didn't catch. Women did it themselves. Sat in front of cracked mirrors, parting their hair with pins, pulling lice from the scalp like weeds from a garden. They oiled it with bacon grease, braided it tight, covered it with bonnets that held in sweat and kept out dust. No curls, no waves, no ribbons, unless it was Sunday, and even then it was a show more than a comfort. Children were shaved bald in the summer, not for fashion, but for survival. Lice liked warmth. So did ticks. Better to have sunburn than a scalp full of things that crawled. Boys got used to it. Girls wept when the scissors came out, but the crying never lasted. Nothing did in the heat. You wouldn't last a day, not because your hair would betray you, but because you'd feel it shift on your head like it didn't belong to you. You'd run your fingers through it and feel the weight, the heat, the stickiness of days gone unwashed. You'd want a hot rinse, a soft towel, a clean comb, and all they'd offer was a hat. Still, there were small graces. A mother combing her daughter's hair before dawn, singing something so low it barely counted as a melody. A stranger offering his comb to a soldier before battle, saying, "Start clean, even if you won't end that way." A woman saving her last coin not for food, but for a single wash, the kind with a warm basin, a borrowed brush, and silence. The comb is gentle. The water is warm. Your hair is clean. There are no insects hiding, no ash rubbed into the roots, no bonnet pressing down your thoughts. You're not tangled. You're not too tired to tend yourself. You are soft again. Let your scalp breathe. Let the wind carry no dust, no sweat, no secrets. Let your thoughts fall like strands onto the pillow. You are not in the barber's chair you are not scrubbing with, and let the hair fall like quiet rain, hands that couldn't come clean. They were tools, not ornaments, not something to be pampered or softened or admired in lamplight. Hands in the Wild West told your story before your mouth ever opened. Calloused, cracked, raw from rope or reins or rough wood. Nails bitten, broken, stained with grease or blood or ink that wouldn't come off. Palms rubbed red from hauling buckets, from gripping shovel handles, from days of tying knots that held back hunger or hurt. These were not clean hands. These were hands that worked. There was no hand soap. Not really. Maybe lye, if someone had boiled the fat right. Maybe sand, if you needed to scour something out. Maybe a rag dipped in whiskey, not to disinfect, but to dull whatever infection had already crept in. Cuts went unnoticed until they festered. Blisters broke and healed under layers of dirt. And fingernails? No clippers, just teeth, or a knife, or the hope they'd wear down on their own. Clean meant practical. If the dirt didn't fall into your stew, you were clean enough. If your blood didn't smear on the baby's blanket, you were clean enough. No one expected more, because there wasn't more to give. Washing your hands before dinner was something preachers said, but even they had grime around their knuckles. You couldn't find a clean pair of hands unless they were in a coffin. People tied handkerchiefs around their palms, not for show, but to hide. A trembling from cold or pain. A wound too small to speak about. A wedding ring that no longer had a finger to hold. And when someone touched you, a handshake, a squeeze, a blessing, it wasn't about cleanliness. It was about honesty. Your hands didn't lie. You wouldn't last a day. Not because you couldn't stand the filth, but because you'd notice it too much. You'd wash again and again, and still feel the dust, the stickiness, the invisible residue of effort that never ends. You'd look down and feel that these weren't your hands anymore, that they'd become something else, tools, weapons, memories pressed into flesh. Still, even then, there were moments of grace. A woman rubbing honey into her palms at night, whispering it kept the skin from cracking in the cold. A child drawing in the dust with a fingertip, making shapes that turned the filth into something lovely. A man who'd lost 3 fingers in a mill accident pressing the last 2 into his lover's back as if they were enough. The bucket is empty. The rag has been set down. The wind no longer carries sawdust or blood. Your hands are still. No rope burns. No blisters. No shame in your skin. You are not too dirty to be held. You are not too worn to be worthy. Let your fingers loosen. Let your palms rest against something soft. You are not gripping a shovel. You are not cleaning a wound. You are not brushing aside your own exhaustion. The work is done. And the dirt does not follow you here, feet that never got to rest. They carried everything. The weight of the miles, the weight of the days, the weight of the body when the spirit had long since gone quiet. In the Wild West, feet weren't something you talked about unless they failed you. Blisters didn't get sympathy. They got boots stuffed with rags. Sprains didn't get rest. They got walked on until they broke. A man was judged by his stride, not his comfort. A woman by how long she could stand on rough floors without sitting. And children? They learned early that pain beneath the ankle wasn't special. It was simply part of growing into the dust. Shoes were a luxury. Good ones, even more so. Most people wore boots until they cracked, then patched them with leather from old belts, bits of canvas, horsehide. Soles worn thin until stones bit through. Heels canted sideways from months of uneven walking. Laces replaced with wire, or nothing at all. Socks were rare. Changed only when holes made them useless. The smell of damp leather and old sweat lingered like something living, something bred in shadows and soaked into the seams. Clean feet weren't just rare, they were impossible. No matter how often you rinsed them, in creeks, in horse troughs, with leftover coffee if nothing else, the grime returned. Dirt lived in the folds between toes, under the nails, along the edges of cracked heels. Skin peeled. Fungus took root in the dark places. And infections, quiet at first. Then swelling, then blackness. Then sometimes a toe lost in a barn at midnight, with no doctor, no witness, and no one brave enough to say they saw it coming. They wrapped them in cloth, bandaged them with strips torn from shirts already worn thin, rubbed lard into the soles to keep the skin from splitting. And still, the pain came. Quiet, constant, humming beneath every step like a reminder that rest was something imagined, not earned. You wouldn't last a day, not because your feet would fail, but because you'd be expected to ignore them. To walk anyway. To run if needed. To ride hard through broken trail and never speak of the rawness building with each jolt of the saddle. You'd feel it, every pebble, every crack, every blister trying to form, and wonder how anyone kept moving through so much quiet pain. Still, there were brief moments of softness. A woman soaking her feet in cool water at the end of a long ride, humming something half-remembered from childhood. A father washing his son's feet by lantern light after a long day of walking fence lines, brushing the dirt away like it might teach the boy gentleness. A stranger at a way station who shared his last clean pair of socks with a traveler he'd never see again. The trail is behind you. The boots have been set aside. The dust has been wiped from your soles. No blisters rise, no bones ache. You are still. You are off your feet. And the world can carry itself, for once, without your help. Let your heels soften. Let your arches lift into rest. Let your toes uncurl, free from leather, free from pressure, free from the long march that never seemed to end. You are not walking now. You are not needed anywhere. You are exactly where you belong. And let your feet forget the road, the smell that lingered everywhere. It didn't hit you all at once. It crept in, settled in the folds of your shirt, wrapped itself around your hat, drifted in through cracks in the door, hung over meals, clung to the backs of horses and men alike. In the Wild West, there was no such thing as fresh. The air was always full of something: smoke, sweat, manure, old grease, dust warmed by the sun and stirred by boots. Everything smelled like something that had been alive too long or died too slowly. Homes didn't have ventilation. Windows were small, sealed in winter, stuck shut in summer. Curtains rarely moved. Air sat heavy, carrying the combined scent of wood smoke and old meat, of sweat rubbed into floorboards, of clothes that hadn't been washed in weeks or months. Beds smelled like people, like oil from their hair and salt from their skin. The smell wasn't just in the bedding, it was the bedding. Food added to it. Salt pork left on the stove too long. Beans cooked over low fire until the pot scorched. Sour bread rising on a windowsill near the outhouse. People got used to it, not because it wasn't bad, but because it was everywhere. It stopped being strange. It became the background hum of existence, a smell that wasn't a single thing, but all things pressed together. There was no perfume. Maybe a pinch of lavender in a drawer, maybe rose water saved for Sunday, if you had coin and reason. But for the most part, the smell of a person was the story of their labor. You could tell a miner by the metallic edge, a cattle hand by the leather and hay, a woman with children by the scent of spit and milk and lye soap, never quite rinsed out. And under it all, always, was the body. A body working too hard. A body with no time for softness. Armpits that stung. Feet that never dried. Breath sour from bad teeth and worse meals. People smelled like what they were. Tired animals. Trying to be civil. Trying to survive. You wouldn't last a day. Not because of the stink itself, but because of how impossible it would be to forget. You'd smell it in your own clothes. You'd feel it catch in the back of your throat, follow you into sleep. Cling to your hands no matter how often you wash them. You'd ask, "Doesn't anyone notice?" And they'd say, "Notice what?" Still, they tried to cover it. Cedar shavings in trunks, tobacco rubbed into coats. Mint chewed just long enough to pass a greeting. Some burned sage, some bathed in whiskey. Some simply stepped outside at night, into the wind, and let it all fall off them for just a breath or two. The fire has gone out. The pot is empty. The clothes are folded, and the bed has been turned. There is no odor in this room but quiet, no smoke in your hair, no sweat in your shirt. You are clean, not because the world allowed it, but because the night does. Let the scent of sleep find you, cool and gentle. Let it drift around you like fresh air through a window you forgot was open. You are not in the saloon. You are not beside the stable. You are far from the days when bodies were too busy surviving to smell sweet. And let the air be kind again. Baths were a luxury, not a right. There was no bathtub waiting behind a curtain. No steam rising from clean tiles. No lavender-scented soap. In the Wild West, a bath wasn't something you took. It was something you earned. Something you planned for. Something that only came around after weeks of sweat and saddle sores, when the filth layered so thick it felt like a second skin. Most folks didn't bathe weekly. Many didn't bathe monthly. A bath was an event, and not a private one. The typical bath was a tin tub, dragged into the middle of a room, often the kitchen, filled with water heated one bucket at a time over a fire that never seemed hot enough. It took hours to prepare and even longer to cool down. The first person in got the best of it. The rest, murky, lukewarm water already clouded with someone else's grime. Families bathed in order, oldest first, babies last. And by then, the bathwater wasn't really water anymore. Just a tired soup of skin, soap, and whatever you were too tired to scrub off. Public bathhouses existed, if you were near a town big enough to afford one. A place with a sign that said, "Hot water, 15C," and a man at the front desk who never looked you in the eye. You'd step inside, strip behind a screen, and step into water shared by dozens. Maybe the tub had been drained. Maybe not. Maybe the towel was clean, maybe not. But it didn't matter. You soaked anyway, grateful just to feel different for a few minutes. Less itchy, less heavy, more like yourself. Soap was harsh. Made from animal fat and lye, it burned if you had cuts, and it always smelled faintly of something that shouldn't be on skin. But it worked, in a way. It didn't leave you fresh, it just stripped the worst of it. Scrub too hard and you'd bleed. Scrub too soft and you'd leave the tub as dirty as you entered. It was a balance, like everything else out there. Hair wasn't washed often. Skin cracked from the heat. And if the bath didn't warm you, it wore you out. Most people came out of the tub shaking, exhausted, wrapped in a towel that barely covered what mattered. Then they dressed again, into the same clothes they'd worn before, because clean water didn't mean clean garments. The freshness never lasted. You wouldn't last a day, not because you couldn't find a bath, but because of how precious it would feel. You'd hesitate before stepping into the tub. You'd wince at the smell. You'd expect warmth, and instead get work. And you'd understand slowly that cleanliness wasn't a feeling. It was a memory, something you tried to hold on to until the next chance came, weeks later. Still, some cherished it. A woman in a mining camp boiled lavender into her bathwater, even if the flowers were dry and old. A man in an army outpost saved his tin of soap through 3 winters, using it only on Sundays. A child who'd never seen a bathtub gasped when she touched the warm water, as if it might vanish if she moved too quickly. The tub has been drained. The towel is warm. The room is quiet, and there is no line outside the door. You are not waiting your turn. You are not rushing to finish. You are already clean, and the water has already done its work. Let the heat stay on your skin. Let the steam rise away like a sigh. There is no grime clinging to you, no sweat left behind. You are soft. You are soothed. You are more than the dirt that once wore your name. And let the bath last forever. Disease followed the dust. It started with a cough. Always a cough. Dry and sharp and constant. The kind that rattled deep and refused to leave. In the Wild West, sickness wasn't an emergency. It was a visitor, unwelcome, familiar, patient. It came slow, then fast, then slow again, curling into your lungs and your joints and your thoughts. It lived in the wind, in the water, in the hands of the man you just shook, in the blanket you borrowed last night. There was no hospital, no sterile hallway, just a small room, a thin mattress, and someone beside you wringing out a cloth that wouldn't cool fast enough. Hygiene wasn't just poor, it was nearly impossible. Germs weren't understood the way they are now. People believed in bad air, in curses, in weak constitutions. A man could be fine 1 week and buried the next. Typhoid, consumption, yellow fever, dysentery. Names whispered like superstitions. They didn't talk about prevention, they talked about luck and burial. Doctors were few. Medicine, rare. Most remedies were folk cures: honey, vinegar, whiskey, prayers, steam, leeches. Snake oil men traveled in wagons selling miracle tonics that burned going down and cured nothing but thirst. Some doctors believed in bleeding. Others believed in mustard plasters, or turpentine, or holding the body near fire until the fever broke, or the person did. The sick were tended with love, but not with science. A damp cloth, a spoon of broth, a lullaby hummed through a door left open for airflow. And if one person in a house fell ill, the rest often followed. Whole families taken down by a single breath. Death wasn't loud. It just settled like dust, unavoidable, constant, coating everything. You wouldn't last a day, not because the disease would find you, but because you'd feel the helplessness, the waiting. You'd ask for soap, for bleach, for gloves and masks, and medicine that hadn't been invented yet. You'd try to help, and there would be nothing but warm water and hope. Hope that the fever broke. Hope that the breath returned. Hope that the morning would come with fewer chills. Still, there were quiet kindnesses. A girl who sang to her sick brother every night, even after his cough stopped. A saloon owner who gave up his own bed when the sheriff took ill. A woman who lost her child and spent the rest of her life tending to the ill, as if care could rewrite what grief had carved. The fever has passed. The cough has faded. The wind is clean. The bed is warm. The house is still. No sickness lives here. No shadow at your door. You are untouched, unworried, unburdened. Your breath is soft and even. Your skin cool to the touch. There is no plague in the dust. No ache in your bones. No weight in your chest. You are safe. You are well. You are wrapped in the kind of peace they rarely knew, the peace of health, the gift of rest. And let the world heal without you for a while. Sharing was survival, and the end of clean. They didn't have their own rooms, or beds, or even plates half the time. In the Wild West, privacy was for the rich and cleanliness was for the lucky. Everyone else shared. Blankets, cups, spoons, boots, sickness, sweat. If you were traveling, you slept in bunks lined up shoulder to shoulder, each man wrapped in the same kind of wool blanket, each one soaked in the same kind of work. Boarding houses packed in as many bodies as could fit. One towel might see 3 faces. One wash basin, 5 hands. One bar of soap, if there was any, would be rubbed smooth by strangers before your turn ever came. It wasn't done out of carelessness. It was necessity. A family of 7 living in 2 rooms couldn't afford to be precious. The baby shared the blanket with the grandmother. The brothers shared boots, handed off like torches at dawn. A single hairbrush made its rounds each morning before breakfast, the bristles bent from trying to untangle too many different kinds of silence. Cups were passed around without question. Food eaten straight from pans. Water ladled from barrels already touched by hands and dust and time. A guest in your home meant offering what you had, even if that meant someone else would go without. Germs weren't understood. They weren't unseen dangers, they were just life. Just part of what you took in when you took in company. Lodges, inns, bunkhouses, all of them meant sleeping beside someone who coughed in their sleep, who tossed, who murmured dreams thick with old regrets. You didn't flinch. You didn't complain. You didn't point out the sour smell on the pillow, because one night you might need someone else's pillow, someone else's coat. You wouldn't last a day, not because of the sharing itself, but because of how invisible the boundaries were. You'd want a towel that hadn't touched another neck, a fork that was only yours, a bed that didn't carry the shape of someone else's weight. But they wouldn't understand. To them, separation was wasteful. Distance was a privilege. Cleanliness came after survival, if there was any strength left for it. Still, sharing wasn't all burden. It was warmth sometimes, a stranger letting you rest your head on their pack, A widow offering the last of her bread without asking your name. A group of cowhands sleeping in a circle. Boots pointed out like spokes, sharing heat through a blanket that had never once been washed but still felt like home. The beds are empty. The basin is full. The towel is fresh. There is no one snoring beside you. No one coughing into your shoulder. No stranger pressing too close. You are alone, not in loneliness, but in comfort. You are not on the floor of a crowded bunkhouse. You are not waiting your turn. You are not hoping someone else remembered to clean the ladle. You are where the air is still, the blankets are yours, and the world holds no demands but sleep. Let go of what others once held. You are not responsible for their weight. Only your own breath. Only this softness, and keep it all to yourself. Outhouses and chamber pots, where cleanliness went to die. There were no flushes, no silver handles, no porcelain. Just a hole in the ground and a wooden seat if you were lucky. In the Wild West, using the bathroom wasn't private, wasn't clean, and wasn't something people liked to talk about. But it was there, every day, a part of life that didn't pause for manners or comfort. Just nature, answered by something barely built, always smelling of time and heat and things no one wanted to name. The outhouse stood apart from the house, usually downhill, always downwind. A crooked little shack with warped boards and a slanted roof, sometimes marked with a crescent moon on the door, not for decoration, but for air. Inside, it was hot in summer, frozen in winter, buzzing with flies in every season. The pit below it filled slowly, then quickly, then not at all, because no one wanted to dig another. There was no toilet paper, just leaves. Sometimes old newspaper, sometimes nothing. A corn cob if you were especially poor or unlucky. The smell never left. It curled into your clothes, into your hair, into the fabric of your sleep. Everyone learned to breathe through the mouth. Everyone learned to hurry. At night, no one wanted to walk to the outhouse. It was cold, it was far, it was dark. So people used chamber pots, little ceramic bowls tucked under the bed. They did what they had to do, and in the morning, someone emptied it. Usually the youngest, or the quietest, or the one who couldn't say no fast enough. It sloshed, it splashed, it spilled, but no one complained, because that was just how it was. Hygiene didn't apply. You washed your hands if you had water. If you didn't, you wiped them on your trousers and moved on. The smell clung to walls, to shoes, to memory. Even churches had outhouses, even schools, even doctors. Cleanliness stopped where the outhouse began, and no one expected anything more. You wouldn't last a day, not because of the outhouse itself, but because of how normal it was. You'd see the flies and the stained boards and wonder how anyone could step inside. But they did, every day, without flinching, because there were no other choices. No running water, no tiled floor, just a shack, a pit, and a hope that the wind would blow the right way. Still, there were moments of grace, a woman who sprinkled pine needles on the floorboards to sweeten the air, a man who painted the door blue because he thought it helped, a child who lined the rim with wildflowers one spring, not to mask the smell but to make the silence inside feel less lonely. The door is shut. The pot is empty. The night is cool and clean. You're not squatting in the dark. You're not holding your breath. You're far from the shack, from the flies, from the cold seat that never quite. The earth has covered what needed to be forgotten. The wind carries no stench. The floor beneath you is steady and still. You are untouched, unbothered, unburdened by the rituals of survival, and let the past bury itself when the doctor was dirtier than the patient. He came with a black bag and a quiet voice, sometimes with a horse, sometimes on foot. He smelled of tobacco and saddle leather, and beneath that, sweat, old blood, and something metallic that never quite left his clothes. In the Wild West, the doctor wasn't a symbol of cleanliness. He was a last resort. A patcher of wounds, a puller of teeth, a guesser of fevers. You didn't call him early, you called him when the body had already started to lose. There were no gloves, no masks, no sterilized instruments. A bone saw was wiped clean with a rag, if at all. Needles were boiled, if there was time. The same hands that treated a gunshot might have held a spittoon that morning. A doctor's coat was rarely white, usually brown, gray, stained in ways you didn't want to ask about. His tools clinked in a bag like bones. Forceps, scissors, thread, whiskey. A bottle of laudanum with the label rubbed off. There was no such thing as a clean table. Surgery happened where there was room, a barn, a porch, a saloon floor. The patient bit down on a stick. The doctor rolled up his sleeves. And that was it. There were no antiseptics, no gowns, no clean water but what someone ran for with a bucket and brought back already clouded with dust. If you lived, it wasn't because of cleanliness. It was because you were stubborn. Because your body decided to keep going. Because luck bent in your direction that day. Infection was almost expected. You watched wounds for days, checking for redness, for heat, for a smell that signaled the end. And when the fever came, so did the prayers. Doctors knew how to save some. But they knew how to bury, too. Some carried their own shovels. Others their own boards, already cut to coffin size. Because sometimes the best thing they could offer was the fastest way to say goodbye. You wouldn't last a day. Not because of the doctor's rough hands, but because of how much trust people placed in them anyway. You'd want antiseptic, lighting, gloves. You'd ask if the tools were clean. And he'd look at you, tired, and say, "They're sharp. That's what matters." Still, some tried. One doctor boiled his tools for hours before every visit, though others laughed at him. One midwife scrubbed her hands with vinegar before delivering every baby and left behind a trail of children who lived longer than most. And one young nurse who came from back east carried a tiny silver cross and washed each wound as if it were sacred. The bag is closed, the wound is healed, the fever has passed. There is no sickness here, no rough hands, no cold metal, no blood on your shirt, just quiet, just rest, just breath that moves without pain. You are not lying on a table, you are not being stitched by lantern light. You are whole, you are safe, you are far from the guesswork and the grit, the whispered diagnoses and the prayers spoken too late. The doctor has gone home, and you don't need him tonight. Clean water was a dream, and hot water even more so. They called it sweet water when it tasted right, when it didn't carry the bite of rust or the rot of something too long sitting still. But most of the time, the water in the Wild West wasn't sweet. It was bitter, warm, clouded, drawn from the bottom of a barrel that hadn't been emptied in days. People drank it because they had to, not because they trusted it. And bathing in it, that was another matter entirely. Clean water was hard. Hot water was a miracle. To bathe in hot water meant building a fire, boiling kettle after kettle, carrying bucket after bucket. It meant planning ahead, not just for the water, but for the time. A bath took half a day's labor, not just yours, but maybe your wife's, your daughter's, your hired hands. Someone had to fetch the wood, stoke the fire, keep it burning steady. Then someone had to haul the water, pour it, stir it, check the temperature with a finger that had already been burned once before. By the time the tub was full, the water was already cooling. You stepped in anyway, lowered yourself slowly into warmth that wouldn't last. Steam rose, the walls of the house creaked, and for one brief moment you remembered what it was to feel clean. Not just washed, but human again. But even that was rare. Most of the time the water came cold. From the river, from a pump, from a spring that had to be cracked open with an axe in winter. It shocked you, woke you, cut through the dirt but not the exhaustion. It took courage to bathe, not because of modesty, because of temperature, because of the sting, you wouldn't last a day. Not because you couldn't handle the cold, but because of how long you'd have to wait for anything better. You'd think of showers, of faucets, of water that flowed when you asked it to. But here, it didn't. You had to earn it. You had to wait. You had to be patient enough to get clean without rushing the ritual. Still, some made it sacred. A woman who lit a candle for every bath she drew, even if the water was cold. A man who warmed a rock by the fire and placed it at the bottom of the tub to keep the water hot just a few minutes longer. A child who named the buckets she carried, whispering thanks with each trip from the well. The water is warm. The fire has been kind. The tub is full. You do not need to carry anything. You do not need to wait your turn. The buckets are already emptied, the warmth already given. Close your eyes. Let the heat curl around your limbs. Let the steam rise and take with it the grit, the dust, the memory of thirst. There is no river to wade into, no pump to prime, no wood to split. Only rest, only water, only peace. And let the bath never go cold. There was no time to be clean. The sun rose early and harsh, and the day didn't wait. In the Wild West, time was measured in sweat, not minutes, not hours. You worked until you couldn't. Then you slept, then you did it again. There wasn't time for a slow wash, for grooming, for any moment of reflection in a mirror, assuming you had one. Hygiene wasn't a luxury, it was a delay. And in a world where delays could cost you your cattle, your crop, or your life, cleanliness was always pushed to the back of the line. Most people woke with dirt still clinging to them from the day before. Their faces smudged, their fingernails black, their shirts stiff with old work. They splashed water on their cheeks maybe, ran fingers through their hair, called it done. A quick rinse at the well if the line wasn't too long. A wipe of the neck with a rag if they had one. But never enough. Never more. The world outside demanded attention, and the body could wait. Mothers tended to babies before they tended to themselves. Fathers harnessed the mule before they even took a sip of water. Children ran barefoot through grass still damp with dew and carried half the ground back into the house with them. By the time the chores were done, no one had the energy to care what they looked like. They were too busy just trying to stay upright. When there was sickness, cleaning mattered, but only then. And even then, it was reaction, not prevention. A clean cloth for a fevered brow. A wash of the hands after digging a grave. A pan of water beside the bed when the coughing got bad. There was no daily ritual, no luxury of rhythm, just effort and collapse. Effort and collapse. You wouldn't last a day, not because you couldn't get clean, but because you'd keep trying anyway. You'd reach for the soap, for the towel, for the basin and find it gone or dry or too far from the fire to be warm. You'd wash your hands 3 times before you realized you were already late. You'd ask yourself how everyone else managed, and they'd tell you they didn't. They just let go. Still, there were moments. A woman rising early just to brush her hair before the baby cried. A man rubbing his boots clean before entering a house that wasn't his. A child washing her hands in a rain barrel and laughing because the water was falling and rising at once. The chores are done. The fire is low. The wind is soft against the door. You are not late. You are not behind. You do not need to rush. You are not one step from falling. You are already here. Let the dirt fall away without your effort. Let the time stretch out, not in tasks, but in stillness. No buckets, no ropes, no scolding for moving too slow. You have all the time in the world to be still, to be clean, to be nothing at all but resting, and let the day pass without you. The dust got inside everything. It didn't matter how tightly you shut the door, how often you swept, how high you hung your clothes. The dust came in anyway. It came in under the doorframe, through the cracks in the walls, down the chimney, and through the fabric of every curtain you'd ever tried to pin closed. It drifted, it floated, it settled. The West wasn't just dusty, it was made of dust. It rose from every step, every wagon wheel, every hooved animal that passed through town. It came from the dry roads, the thirsty hills, the long breathless stretches between water and anything green. There was no escaping it. You ate it with your bread. You drank it with your coffee. You felt it on your tongue when you spoke. It coated the insides of your nose, stuck in the corners of your eyes. You wiped it away, only to have it return the moment you exhaled. It settled on your bed, so that even when you lay down, it was there, a thin, gritty layer on the blanket, like the memory of a sandstorm that had passed through while you were gone. People tried to fight it. Rugs were beaten until they split at the edges. Windows were washed only to cloud again by afternoon. Clothes hung inside came down looking older than when they were pinned. You could spend an hour scrubbing a table and find a new layer of dust the moment your back was turned. It was a losing battle, but they fought it anyway. Because to do nothing felt like giving in. Some people gave in. They stopped wiping their boots before entering the house. They stopped brushing off the shelves. They let the dust settle like a second wallpaper, soft and constant, and decided to live with it, because in the end, that's what you did with the West. You didn't conquer it. You let it shape you. You wouldn't last a day, not because the dust would choke you, but because of how endlessly it returned. You'd clean and clean and clean, and the world would keep undoing you. You'd see the film forming again and wonder what the point was. But the people back then, they knew. The point wasn't to win. It was to keep trying. To claim, even for a moment, a space that was yours, even if the dust would take it back tomorrow. Still, there were small victories. A woman who lined the windowsills with wet cloth to trap the worst of it. A man who wiped down the family Bible every night, even if he never read it, just to keep something sacred free of grit. A child who wrote her name in the dust on the floorboards, not to clean, but to prove she'd been there. The broom is resting. The air has stilled. The dust has settled and is no longer trying to find you. It is quiet now. It does not cling. You are not covered. You are not surrounded. You are wrapped in something soft and untouched. Let the wind stop at the door. Let the corners stay clean. Let the world drift for once without burying you in its breath. You are not a floor to be swept. You are not a shelf to be wiped. You are a person, at peace. And let the dust fall somewhere else tonight. There was no soap for the soul. They washed their hands when they could, their clothes when they had to, their faces on Sundays, before church or funerals. But no one in the Wild West ever truly felt clean, not where it mattered, not deep down, because the dirt you could scrub away was nothing compared to the weight you carried inside. The guilt, the fear, the things you'd seen, the things you'd done to stay alive. And there was no basin deep enough for that. No soap strong enough. No cloth that could wipe it free. The preacher said you could be saved, that sin could be washed clean. But even he had dust behind his ears and blood beneath his fingernails from the time he helped bury a man no one else would touch. The saloon girls laughed when you mentioned confession. They said it was a nice idea, but nothing beat a strong drink and sleep without dreams. If you could find that, most folks didn't speak of their shame. They carried it in their posture, in their silence, in the way their eyes lingered too long on empty chairs, or flicked away when someone mentioned a name that had once mattered. There were things you didn't talk about, not because you'd be judged, but because everyone already had their own to carry. No one had hands free for yours. They cleaned their bodies when they could. But the soul? That stayed stained. Not with sin, exactly, but with wear. With use, like a favorite coat that's seen too many winters and not enough mending. It still fits, it still works, but it never quite smells right again. You wouldn't last a day, not because of what you'd do, but because of what you'd feel. You'd see the quiet sadness in people's faces, the stories they didn't tell, the way they looked at their reflection like it owed them something. You'd want to help, you'd offer words, kindness, a hand, but they wouldn't take it, not because they didn't need it, but because they didn't believe it could last. Still, some tried to wash the inside. A man who wrote every name he wronged in a notebook, then lit the pages one by one in a stove on the last day of every year. A woman who sat by the river every Sunday and whispered things into the current, things she'd never tell anyone else. A child who prayed not for safety or food, but simply for forgiveness, for whatever wrongs he might have done without knowing. The water runs quiet. The sky is clean. The night holds no memory of what you've done or failed to do. You are not your worst moment. You are not the dust you carry in your chest. You are here, and that is enough. Let the soul soak. Let the weight lift. There is no stain too old, no wrong too deep. There is only breath, and silence, and the gentle, wordless cleansing of rest. And be clean where it matters most. Clean was a feeling, not a fact. They didn't have mirrors, not really. Maybe a shard of polished glass nailed to a wall. Maybe a warped tin reflection in a bucket of water. Most of the time, they didn't know what they looked like, only how they felt. Heavy, stiff, salt-crusted from long rides, tight-skinned from wind and sun. Clean was never something you could prove. It was something that passed through you for a moment, like shade, or music, or kindness. You might step outside just after a dust storm and smell the rain that never fell. You might rub your face with a cool cloth and feel for a breath like yourself again. You might wake from a hard sleep and forget for a few seconds how long it had been since your last wash. And that was the closest you'd get. It wasn't about being spotless, it was about being still. Nobody measured cleanliness by scent or soap. They measured it by peace. Were your shoulders down? Could you sit without itching? Did your hands rest in your lap without fidgeting for the next task? If so, you were clean enough. If not, well, there was always tomorrow, or the next spring. Clean didn't mean new. It meant untouched. It meant having a moment that didn't belong to the cattle, or the trail, or the stove, or the sick. A moment that didn't belong to fear. A man with soot on his face could still feel clean if his conscience had gone quiet for a little while. A woman in a flour-stained apron could still feel beautiful if her heart had room to breathe. You wouldn't last a day, not because you'd be dirty, but because you'd be waiting for something more. Waiting for a bar of soap, a white towel, a clear mirror. You'd think it had to look a certain way, but it never did. Out there, clean was never about shine. It was about breath, about space, about not flinching when someone leaned close. Still, they found it. A father brushing the dust from his daughter's hair before supper. A cowhand pulling off his boots and feeling the bare ground for the first time in weeks. A woman closing her eyes while a basin of warm water steamed in her lap, and no one asked her to move. They held on to those moments like gold, The chores are done. The floor is swept. The lamp is low, and the wind is not looking for you. You are not being watched. You are not being used. You are simply here, whole, warm, untouched by demand. Close your eyes. You don't need a bath to feel new. You don't need a mirror to feel whole. You are not measured by what clings to your skin, but by what softens inside you when you rest. Let the day slide off. Let the breath deepen. You are clean. Not because you washed, but because you've stopped running. And let that be enough. Even the cemeteries were covered in dust. They buried their dead just beyond the edge of town. Always just beyond. A place where the ground was dry and the wind never stopped, and even the crosses leaned a little from years of shifting earth. The graves weren't marked with stone, not usually. Just wood, carved quick and shallow. Names worn away before the grief ever really settled. In the Wild West, dying wasn't a clean thing, and being dead didn't mean you stayed untouched. The bodies were prepared, if someone had the time. If the weather hadn't turned, or the undertaker wasn't drunk, or the preacher hadn't ridden out with the last mail coach. Maybe you'd be washed, maybe not. Maybe someone would close your eyes. Maybe they'd cover your face with a sheet and leave it at that. Most of the time, it was family, or neighbors, or a stranger who felt obligated, just this once, to do something decent. There was no embalming, no satin-lined casket, just pine, usually. Cheap, thin, fastened with nails that creaked as they were hammered in. If the body was left too long before burial, the smell would follow. Into the church, into the street, into the dreams of the people who walked by. And even after the ground closed over you, it didn't stay shut. The dust didn't care. It blew across the graves like water across stone. It covered every name, every flower, every prayer. People stopped visiting after a while. Not because they stopped caring, because the markers disappeared. A fence would fall. A marker would rot. A child's grave would be lost in a patch of weeds. Death in the West was fast, rough, quiet, and so was the remembering. You wouldn't last a day, not because of the sadness, but because of the way it didn't seem to stop anyone. The town moved on. The dust blew through. The wind erased, and the people let it. You'd want to clean the graves, to tend the names, to say, this one mattered, but the people would shake their heads. They all mattered, they'd say, and the dust will cover them just the same. Still, a few kept trying. A widow who swept her husband's grave every morning with a willow broom. A child who laid a single coin on his sister's marker once a year, even after the wood had turned to ash. A gravedigger who hummed lullabies as he lowered the coffins, whispering, "You're not alone, not here." The dust has quieted. The wind has gone still. The earth holds what it must, but it does not reach for you. You are above the ground, warm and breathing, not a name fading in the sun. You are not forgotten. You are not scattered. You are not waiting for someone to write your name in the dirt. You are here, held, named in silence, remembered in stillness, and let the dust blow past you. Cleanliness was seasonal, if it came at all. There were parts of the year when it just didn't happen, not because people didn't want it, but because the world didn't allow it. Winter froze everything solid. Water became stone. Wash basins cracked. Hands went raw from cold before they ever got wet. You couldn't boil enough to bathe. You couldn't haul enough to spare. People wiped themselves with snow or didn't bother at all. They curled into clothes that hadn't been changed in weeks and hoped the fire burned high enough to chase off the stink. Then came spring, and with it, the thaw. That was when people tried. Rivers ran again. rain came in bursts. Women poured buckets through their children's hair and lined their porches with wet shirts flapping like prayer flags. Men took shirts off by the creek and let the sun scald the grime from their backs. Everything smelled like old earth, like soaked wood, like damp wool. Not clean exactly, but closer to it. Summer made things worse again. Sweat soaked through collars. Dust stuck to skin like a second hide. The heat turned every house into a pot simmering with breath and effort and rot. Livestock baked in their pens. Water grew scarce. People drank what they could, washed what they had to, and ignored the rest. No one expected you to smell good, only to keep breathing. Fall was fleeting. A pause. A chance to wash the wool blankets before winter came again. A chance to clean the floorboards, to pour out the wash basin and scrub the boards while the sun still warmed the porch. People trimmed their hair, sewed the holes in their socks, checked their boots for mold. And then, just like that, the cold returned, and everything froze over again. Hygiene came and went like the weather. It wasn't a routine. It was a window, narrow and quick to close. If you missed it, you waited until it came again. You bore it. You slept beside it. You let the dirt become part of your clothing, your skin, your life. And you didn't speak of it, not because it was shameful, but because it was normal. You wouldn't last a day, not because of the filth, but because of the waiting. You'd mark days on the wall, counting down to your next wash. You'd carry your towel like a promise. And they'd tell you, don't bother, it'll rain eventually. And you'd wonder how they kept smiling. Still, some people marked the seasons with water. A woman who heated her bath on the equinox and burned sage while she soaked. A boy who shaved his head every spring to start again. A man who walked into the river once each summer, alone, and stood there until the sun touched the mountains. The season doesn't matter here. It is neither too hot nor too cold. The water flows steady, if only in your memory. The wind is gentle. The dust has gone quiet. You're not waiting for the weather to turn. You are not trapped between thaw and freeze. You are not rationing warmth. You are not holding out for a better day. The better day is here. The stillness is yours. The air is kind. And let the seasons pass without need. The animals were cleaner than the people. They didn't mean to be. They just lived as they were, rolling in mud, standing in creeks, brushing against trees, never worrying about filth because filth was what they were made to live in. Horses slick with sweat, dust clinging to their flanks, manes tangled but soft. Dogs covered in burrs, tongues lolling out, eyes bright and never ashamed. Cattle sleeping in their own dung, chewing slowly, eyes half-lidded and unbothered. Animals were honest. They didn't pretend. And in the Wild West, people looked at them and felt something close to envy, because animals didn't try to be clean. They didn't scrub. They didn't flinch at their own smell. They lived in it, carried it. And because of that, they often seemed freer. People, on the other hand, worked hard to be something else, something beyond the dirt. They wore boots to keep their feet from touching the ground. They built walls to keep out the weather. They wiped their faces, even when there was nothing clean to wipe with. But the truth was, they were always chasing what the animals had naturally, a kind of peace with their own bodies. In the morning, you'd find horses coated in a thin layer of dust that glittered in the sunlight. You'd find goats jumping in the mud, their coats matted and shining with health. Meanwhile, a man might be scrubbing his hands raw, trying to wash away a stain that had nothing to do with dirt. A woman might be combing her hair with shaking fingers, knowing it would tangle again the moment the wind picked up. The animals didn't care. They shook. They ran. They rested in filth and rose as though it had done them good. They cleaned themselves the way nature taught them, by living. Not by resisting the dirt, but by moving through it. You wouldn't last a day, not because of the animals, but because of what they made you realize. That maybe you've been chasing something that doesn't exist. That maybe cleanliness, real cleanliness, isn't about what clings to your skin, but about how gently you treat yourself when the world gets messy. Still, some people learned from them. A woman who slept beside her dog in winter, because its warmth and stink felt more human than any blanket. A rancher who let his horse lead him to the cleanest water when his own eyes failed. A child who bathed with the pigs just to feel joy in the mess. The barn is quiet. The hooves are still. The dogs have curled into themselves, warm and unaware of what clings to their fur. You are not judged by your scent, not measured by your neatness, not compared to anything but your own breath. Let the animals keep watch tonight. Let their steadiness calm you. Let their stillness be yours. They are not worried. They are not ashamed. And neither are you. As honest as a horse, as unbothered as a dog, as at peace as something that has never tried to be anything but alive. The dirt was in the walls. It didn't stay outside. It never did. You could sweep the porch, shake the rugs, beat the dust from your coat before stepping through the door. And still, the dirt came in. It sank into the floorboards. It puffed out of the mattresses when you sat down too hard. It crept behind the stove, under the cupboards, into the beams above your head. Even the walls, if you touched them just right, gave off a powder, a faint smudge, a reminder. In the Wild West, homes were made fast. Logs chinked with clay, boards nailed into frames that shifted with the seasons. There was no insulation, no sealant, just wood and wind and hope. And the world outside, that endless, gritty world, came in with every gust. It settled in the corners, behind the curtains, inside the folds of your only good coat. It wasn't filth, it was just there, as natural as breath, as persistent as memory. People stopped fighting it after a while. They swept daily, sure, but never expected the floors to stay clean. They mopped when they could. Old water, old rags, but even that was more habit than hope. Children played on dirty floors. Babies teethed on wooden spoons that had dropped into ash. Meals were cooked beside windowsills coated in a fine, permanent layer of dust. Clean wasn't a place. It was a moment, a pause between one gust of wind and the next. You'd walk into a home back then and smell the history. Wood smoke, boiled potatoes, iron, wool, and the unmistakable scent of dry dirt warmed by sun and skin. The smell of effort, of survival, of everything they couldn't wash away. And you'd feel it in the walls, in the way they held heat too long, in the way they sighed when the wind blew hard, in the way the silence wrapped around you like a faded blanket. You wouldn't last a day, not because of the dirt itself, but because you'd want to believe it could be beaten. That with enough scrubbing, enough soap, enough effort, you could return the house to something pure. But they knew better. They knew the house wasn't dirty. It was lived in. And that meant dust. That meant scent. That meant everything that made it theirs. Still, they found beauty in it. A woman tracing her finger through the dust on the mantel, spelling out her husband's name. A child painting pictures on the floorboards with water from the kettle. A man brushing his hand along the wall before stepping outside, as if the dust itself might wish him luck. The wind has settled. The walls are quiet. The floor is swept, not spotless, but enough. You are not expected to clean tonight. You are not expected to chase away what has always been part of the home. Chloe Isur eyes. The dust does not judge you. The walls do not ask for more than breath. You are surrounded not by dirt, but by history, by warmth, by rest that does not depend on polish. Let the house hold you, just as it is, Let the dust stay where it chooses. You are clean enough to dream. No one had time to wash the past away. The past clung harder than sweat. It clung harder than the smell of old smoke in your coat or the grit beneath your fingernails. In the Wild West, what had been done, what had been seen, lost, hurt, or buried, stayed. It stayed in the eyes of old men who sat on porches and didn't speak unless the sun had dipped low. It stayed in the way someone flinched when a door slammed. It stayed in silence around certain names. People didn't have the words for trauma, not then. They had phrases. He's not right since the war, or she took to her bed, or he rides alone now. But they didn't speak of cleaning the mind or healing the spirit. They had whiskey, they had distance, they had work, endless work, to distract the aching things that never got rinsed away. No one had time to sit and reflect. Reflection was for poets. And poets didn't last long on the frontier. There was always something to fix, something to gather, something to chase, something to bury. You went to bed tired, hoping the dreams would be quiet. Sometimes they were, often they weren't. But you woke anyway, washed your face, if there was water, stepped into the same boots, carried on. And the strange part was, they carried each other too, quietly, without fuss. One man would split wood for another who hadn't spoken in 3 days. A woman would bring stew to a neighbor who hadn't opened her curtains since the baby stopped crying. No one called it healing. No one called it care. But it was there, gentle, like brushing dust from a shoulder, like covering a mirror, like humming a hymn without thinking about why. You wouldn't last a day, not because the pain would overwhelm you, but because of how quietly everyone bore it. You'd want to ask, "How do you live like this?" And they'd shrug. You just do. You'd want to fix it, scrub it out, shine it up. But they weren't looking to be cleaned, only understood, still. There were soft moments, a letter never sent, read aloud to the fire just to hear the words. A hat held too long after a funeral. A song half remembered, sung low to the stars when no one else was awake. Small rituals, like washing, but for the soul. The past isn't knocking tonight. The boots are off, the coals have dimmed. The quiet isn't hiding anything, it's here to hold you. No names echo in your ears, no regrets reach for your hands. Just breath, just rest. Just the soft hush of a night that wants nothing from you but stillness. You are not what happened. You are not what was done or undone. You are only here, breathing, whole, unfinished in the best way.